Slavery in ancient Rome is often presented in a simplified manner, yet in reality, it was a phenomenon steeped in nuances and contradictions. A natural question arises: was the master's power over a slave absolute and boundless, or were there certain boundaries that curbed arbitrary rule? To understand this, one must imagine being in the shoes of someone whose life and destiny depended entirely on another's whim, in a system where their very existence held no value. This was the reality for millions in the Roman Empire. And while at first glance it might seem that a master was free to dispose of a slave's life as they wished, history reveals the presence of limitations, albeit minor. Consider one of the most striking examples, which occurred during a luxurious feast hosted by the wealthy Vettius Pollio. An unfortunate slave made a blunder, breaking a crystal goblet, which Pollio deemed an unforgivable offense punishable by death. The enraged master ordered the slave to be thrown into a pond teeming with hungry lampreys, predatory fish known for their ability to strip flesh from living creatures. It seemed the slave's fate was sealed, but Emperor Augustus himself unexpectedly intervened. The emperor not only saved the slave from a torturous death, but also granted him freedom. As a symbolic punishment for the cruel master, Augustus ordered all of Pollio's remaining goblets to be smashed. This act prompts a natural question: what motivated Augustus? Was it an act of mercy and compassion towards the slave? The story behind this decision reveals deeper aspects of power in Rome and demonstrates that, despite the apparent impunity, there were certain limits to what was permissible in the treatment of slaves. To truly grasp the essence of the slavery system that flourished in ancient Rome, one must delve into its origins, which stretch back centuries. Slavery was not a novelty for the Romans, having emerged long before the founding of the Eternal City. On the contrary, this practice was so deeply ingrained in societal life that even Rome's legendary founder, Romulus, permitted his citizens to sell their own offspring into slavery. Thus, from its very inception, slavery became not merely an economic component, but a fundamental element of the social structure of Roman society. As Rome gained power and expanded its territories, so too did the number of slaves. Transforming from a small settlement into a mighty power, Rome constantly waged wars, resulting in thousands of prisoners of war being enslaved. By the 1st century AD, by some estimates, slaves constituted a significant portion of Rome's population, up to 20%. Such reliance on slave labor not only fueled the Roman economy, but also significantly influenced the daily lives of Roman citizens. In the early days of Roman history, slavery had a more domestic, personal character. Masters worked side by side with their slaves in the fields or managed their households together. However, over time, slavery acquired the characteristics of industrialization and mass scale, losing its former personal connection between masters and slaves. What began as a relatively equitable relationship, where a master saw a slave almost as a family member, degenerated into brutal exploitation. Slaves ceased to be perceived as individuals with their own histories and destinies, transforming into a faceless mass, merely numbers, used on the vast villas and boundless fields of the Roman Empire. Over time, as the Roman Empire expanded its dominion, the institution of slavery underwent significant changes. Initially, slaves constituted an insignificant portion of the population, and their labor was more personal, akin to family relationships. Masters not only owned slaves, but also shared daily life with them, often working side by side in the field or at home. However, with the growth of Rome's influence, this connection began to weaken. As a result of military campaigns, vast numbers of slaves arrived in Rome. These were no longer individual captives, but entire groups of people brought from distant lands, stripped of their identity, and transformed into faceless property. Slavery lost its former, almost familial character and became a ruthless mechanism of mass exploitation, where slaves were regarded merely as economic resources, devoid of human dignity. The increase in the number of slaves also influenced the worldview of their owners. Previously, a slave was an acquaintance, performing specific work in the house or on the farm. Now, an atmosphere of impersonality and alienation prevailed. A slave ceased to be a member of the family or community, transforming into a simple instrument for profit, a commodity that could be freely bought and sold. This turning point had far-reaching consequences. Consequently, with a significant increase in the number of slaves, controlling their potential escapes became increasingly difficult. In the early Roman era, a runaway slave could easily hide in nearby settlements or among hostile tribes. However, over time, slaves were concentrated on vast villas and agricultural estates. The growth of cities led to a substantial reduction in opportunities for a successful escape. Freedom became an even more unattainable dream, and masters' fear of slaves fleeing noticeably diminished. Eventually, as slavery became an increasingly entrenched institution in Rome, cruel treatment of slaves by masters became an almost inevitable phenomenon. In the absence of effective laws capable of protecting slaves, masters gained unlimited power to inflict any punishment they desired: beatings, forced labor, torture, and mutilation. Violence became commonplace, rather than an exception to the rule. Slaves were regarded as property, and, like any other tool, they could be discarded when they became useless. Nevertheless, despite the ruthless nature of this system, Roman society did not remain entirely indifferent to extreme acts of cruelty. There were certain social norms, and some legislative acts, though limited in their effect and rarely applied in practice, which attempted to curb the most egregious abuses. During the Roman Republic, where slavery was an integral part of the social structure, there was a gaping hole in the system of protecting human dignity. The master's power over a slave was virtually boundless, leading to widespread abuse and cruelty. Attempts to curb this arbitrary rule were made, but they were sporadic and ineffective. One institution tasked with controlling this barbaric practice was that of the censor. This magistrate had the authority to intervene in situations where cruelty towards slaves reached extreme levels. However, his intervention was not obligatory, depending solely on his personal discretion. Only if a free citizen reported a blatant act of abuse could the censor begin an investigation. And while theoretically the censor could prevent an atrocity, in practice this mechanism was far from perfect. Over 4 centuries of the Republic's existence, there is no record of censors protecting a single slave from arbitrary rule. In rare cases, public opinion served as the only protection for slaves. If a master crossed the line, he might face condemnation from society. But this form of protection was extremely unreliable and offered slaves no real guarantees. Despite the prevailing cruelty, sometimes violence reached such proportions that Roman society could not remain indifferent. One striking example is Emperor Augustus's intervention in a case which, on the one hand, reflected the inhumanity of the system, and on the other, demonstrated that the power of Rome could sometimes be used to curb the excessive cruelty of the elite. The story of the slave who broke a goblet at the feast of the Roman equestrian Vettius Pallios serves as a vivid example of imperial intervention in master's arbitrary rule. An enraged Pallio ordered the unfortunate man to be thrown into a pond with bloodthirsty lampreys, known for their appetite for human flesh. However, Augustus, who was present at this dinner party, made a decision that astonished everyone. He not only saved the slave from certain death, but also granted him freedom. As a symbolic retribution for the cruelty, the emperor ordered all of Pallios' remaining goblets to be smashed. This extraordinary case demonstrates how supreme authority could curb abuses, but not out of mercy, rather as a lesson to overzealous nobles. Augustus taught a lesson: Even those vested with power must observe certain boundaries. Nevertheless, such cases remain more the exception than the rule, and countless acts of cruelty towards slaves went unpunished. Over time, laws aimed at protecting slaves began to appear in Roman law, but they were dictated not so much by moral considerations as by a desire to avoid social upheavals. An exhausted slave, deprived of hope for salvation, represented a potential threat to public order. Large revolts, such as Spartacus's uprising, clearly showed that Rome needed to take measures to prevent the destruction of the existing order. The first seeds of legislative acts aimed at regulating the treatment of slaves emerged during the Roman Empire. One such example was the Lex Patronia, which came into force in 61 AD. This law prohibited sending slaves to the amphitheater arena to be killed by wild beasts without prior approval from a magistrate. The purpose of this legislative act was to limit the practice of public executions used as private entertainment. The state sought to establish a monopoly on the manifestation of violence in the public sphere, curbing the aristocracy's desire to act as executioners for their own amusement. At the same time, contractual norms began to appear which, although not intended to protect the rights of slaves, imposed certain restrictions on the actions of masters in a number of cases. One of the best-known examples is the provision prohibiting forced prostitution. This norm directly forbade compelling a female slave to provide sexual services. In the event of a violation of this provision by a new owner, the slave was to be immediately freed and recognized as a free person. However, despite the seemingly progressive nature of these provisions, their adoption was not dictated by a desire for social justice. Often, they were used to protect economic interests or the reputation of a family or owner. For example, a previous owner might include such a provision in a sales contract to avoid a public scandal, rather than for moral reasons. Roman law, despite its severity, occasionally showed glimpses of humanity regarding slavery. These measures, though largely symbolic, demonstrated that even within a brutal system, the law could play a role in preventing absolute arbitrary rule. Nevertheless, in most cases, a slave's fate was still determined by the personal qualities of their owner, making a slave's life extremely unpredictable. Despite all the efforts of imperial Rome to introduce laws and restrictions, it must be acknowledged that these measures often remained a mere formality. Their true purpose was not the recognition of slaves' human dignity, but the prevention of social unrest and destabilization that could arise from the discontent and uncontrollability of the vast slave population. Under emperors such as Antoninus Pius and Constantine, Rome took some steps towards recognizing a slave's value beyond their economic utility. For instance, a law passed by Antoninus Pius in 161 AD prohibited the unjustified killing of slaves. This meant that a master who deliberately took a slave's life would face the same punishment as if they had killed a free person. This law, albeit with limitations, indicated that slaves were beginning to receive some legal protection. Despite the existence of legislative acts intended to regulate the treatment of slaves in some way, Roman law never managed to recognize them as full members of society. Abuses against slaves remained unpunished, and only in those cases where violence took particularly egregious forms that disturbed public order was the state compelled to intervene. This meant that the fates of millions of people deprived of freedom remained indifferent to society, and their suffering and death went unnoticed. Slavery in ancient Rome was not merely a form of oppression, but a deeply ingrained economic and social system. The Roman Empire built its power and prosperity on the exploitation of millions of slaves, whose labor ensured its wealth and authority. And although some emperors tried to limit the most brutal manifestations of this system, it never abandoned the view of slaves as soulless property. It is important to remember that the restrictions imposed on slave owners in Rome were largely symbolic and held little significant meaning. They were not aimed at protecting the human dignity of slaves, but at maintaining the stability of a system founded on their exploitation and disenfranchisement.